The day I overheard my children dividing up my estate while I lay in the next room fighting for my life was the day I realized that blood isn't always thicker than water. I was supposed to be resting, conserving my strength for another brutal round of chemotherapy the following morning. But instead, I found myself frozen in place, listening to my twin children, Thackeray and Morwen, discussing who would get my vintage record collection, my lakeside cabin in Osprey Cove, and even the emerald pendant my grandmother had left specifically for me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mom's oncologist gave her 6 months at best, Thackeray said, his voice carrying that business-like tone he'd perfected during his years as a financial consultant. We need to get everything in order before she's too weak to sign the paperwork. I want the cabin, Morwen replied without hesitation. I've always loved that place, and I can turn it into a vacation rental. Do you know how much lakefront property goes for these days? Besides, you never even visit. Fine, but I get her investment portfolio and the art collection. The Callahan piece alone is worth more than the cabin. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My breath caught, and a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my cancer treatment washed over me. These were my children, the twins I'd raised alone after their father Roscoe abandoned us when they were just 3 years old, claiming he wasn't cut out for family life. I'd sacrificed everything to give them the best possible start, working. 2 jobs to put them through private school, selling my jewelry to fund Morwen's art therapy business, investing my retirement savings to help Thackeray establish his consulting firm. And now here they were, standing in my kitchen eating the soup I'd somehow managed to make that morning despite my exhaustion, dividing my possessions while I still drew breath. What about her emerald pendant? Morwen asked. It would look perfect with my gala dress. You can have it, Thackeray said dismissively. Jewelry doesn't interest me, but I want her first editions collection. Some of those books are worth a fortune to the right collector. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. The first editions had been my sanctuary during the darkest days of single motherhood. When I couldn't afford babysitters for nights out or vacations away, I'd escaped into those pages, collecting them one by one with whatever spare change I managed to save. What about Lyra? Morwen asked, referring to my closest friend who had been more present in my cancer journey than my own children. She's been hovering around Mom like a vulture. We need to make sure she doesn't manipulate her way into the will. I almost gasped aloud. Lyra had been driving me to chemotherapy sessions, preparing meals when I was too weak to cook, and sitting with me through countless sleepless nights when the pain was too intense for rest. She'd never once asked for anything in return. I've already spoken with Finwick, Thackeray said, mentioning our family attorney. He's drawing up new documents that will expedite the transfer of assets. We just need to get Mom to sign them. That was the moment something in me changed. A strange calm settled over me, replacing the initial shock and heartbreak. I quietly made my way back to my bedroom, careful not to alert them to my presence, and for the first time since my diagnosis, I felt something other than fear and resignation. I felt resolve. My name is Elowen Blackthorne, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had raised 2 compassionate, grateful children. At 57, I'd built a comfortable life for us in the artistic community of Crestfall Bay, a small coastal town known for its dramatic cliffs and thriving arts scene. I'd transformed our family's financial situation through careful investments, and my surprisingly successful career as a botanical illustrator for scientific publications, a passion that had started as merely a hobby. My cancer diagnosis came suddenly. Stage 3 ovarian cancer discovered during what should have been a routine checkup. The oncologist, Dr. Thorne, had been clinical but kind when delivering the news. We'll start aggressive treatment immediately, but you should prepare yourself, Ms. Blackthorne. This will be a difficult road. My first thought wasn't about my mortality, but about my children. Morwen, with her art therapy business that was perpetually about to take off, and Thackeray, whose financial consulting firm was successful but had required significant startup capital I'd provided by liquidating a substantial portion of my retirement fund. The twins were 32 now, an age when they should have been fully independent, yet somehow they both remained financially tethered to me in ways that had once seemed like family support, but now felt increasingly one-sided. Still, they were my children, and I'd assumed they would be my support system through this terrifying journey. How wrong I had been. The day after overhearing their conversation, I made 2 important calls. The first was to Lyra, asking if she could take me to visit Fenwick, my attorney. I'd explained that I needed to review my estate planning given my diagnosis. The second call was to my oncologist, requesting copies of all my medical records and seeking a referral for a second opinion at Meridian Medical Center, a prestigious research hospital 3 hours away. Lyra arrived promptly the next morning, concern etched across her face. "Elawan, are you sure you're up for this today? You look exhausted." I managed a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Some things can't wait, dear friend." Thackeray emerged from the guest room where he'd been staying to help care for me. Though his version of care primarily involved working remotely from my home office and occasionally ordering takeout for dinner. "Where are you going?" he asked, frowning at my street clothes. "Just handling some paperwork with Fenwick," I replied casually. "Cancer has a way of making one consider practical matters." Something flashed in his eyes, relief, perhaps, or anticipation. "That's smart, Mom. Do you want me to come along? I could help explain some of the financial implications." "No need," I said, patting his cheek. "Lyra and I can manage, and I'm sure you have important work calls. Besides, this is fairly straightforward." The meeting with Fenwick was anything but straightforward. I'd known him for decades. He'd handled my divorce from Roscoe and had been managing my legal affairs ever since. His office smelled of leather-bound books and expensive cologne, a combination that had once felt reassuring but now seemed cloying and oppressive. "Elawan, I'm so sorry about your diagnosis," he began, folding his hands atop his mahogany desk. "Your son already reached out about making some adjustments to your estate planning." "Did he?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "And what did my son suggest?" Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. He mentioned expediting certain processes, establishing a medical power of attorney in his name, and potentially creating a living trust that would transfer your assets more efficiently. Lyra's hand found mine beneath the desk, squeezing gently, in silent support. "I see," I said. "And did my daughter contact you as well?" "Yes, just yesterday. She had questions about the Osprey Cove property specifically." I nodded slowly, each confirmation another small wound. "Fenwick, I'd like to make some changes, but not the ones my children suggested." Over the next hour, I laid out my new instructions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. First, I established Lyra, not my children, as my medical power of attorney. Second, I created a new trust with specific conditions for my children's inheritance. And third, I signed documents transferring most of my liquid assets to an account that only I could access, one that would not be considered part of my estate. Fenwick raised his eyebrows at this last request. "This is unusual, Elawan. May I ask why?" "Let's just say I've recently gained some clarity about my family dynamics," I replied. "And I'd like these changes to remain confidential. My children are not to be informed." As we drove home, Lyra kept glancing at me with concern. "What's really going on, Elawan? This isn't like you." I stared out the window at the passing coastline, the familiar cliffs of Crestfall Bay standing defiant against the relentless tide. I've spent my entire adult life being necessary to everyone else. Now I need to focus on being necessary to myself. When we returned home, Morwen had arrived, her designer handbag conspicuously placed on the kitchen counter, a bag I'd helped finance as a business expense for meeting with her affluent clients. "Mom, you shouldn't be out running errands in your condition," she scolded, though her eyes never left her phone screen. "That's what Thackeray and I are here for." "To divide and conquer?" I asked mildly. Her head snapped up. "What?" "Nothing, dear. Just cancer brain making me a bit confused." Over the next few days, I watched my children with new eyes. I noticed how Thackeray organized my financial documents, scanning statements when he thought I was resting. I observed Morwen photographing artwork and furniture, presumably researching values. They spoke about my prognosis with a strange detachment, as if discussing a distant acquaintance rather than their mother. One evening, as we sat in the living room, me bundled under a blanket despite the mild spring temperature, the twins engrossed in their respective devices. Thackeray cleared his throat. "Mom, I've been thinking about your treatment plan. Wouldn't it make more sense to focus on comfort care at this point? The chemotherapy seems to be taking such a toll, and the oncologist said the chances of remission are slim." Dr. Thorne had said no such thing. In fact, while my prognosis was serious, he'd been cautiously optimistic about my response to treatment. "What Dr. Thorne actually said," I replied carefully, "was that we should remain hopeful while being realistic." Morwen joined in, her voice taking on that soothing tone she used with her therapy clients. "Mom, we just hate seeing you suffer through these treatments when you could be enjoying the time you have left. Quality over quantity, you know?" The unspoken message was clear. Die faster, die cheaper. Get out of the way so we can move on with our inheritance. That night, I made my final decision. The next morning, I asked Lyra to take me to the Meridian Medical Center for my second opinion appointment. Dr. Valencia at Meridian reviewed my case with fresh eyes and renewed purpose. "There's an experimental treatment protocol I believe you'd be an excellent candidate for," she explained. "It's intensive and would require you to temporarily relocate closer to our facility, but the preliminary results have been extremely promising for patients with your specific genetic markers." "What are the costs?" I asked, thinking of the assets I'd moved. "It's part of a clinical trial, so the treatment itself is covered. You'd only need to manage living expenses near the hospital." I thought of my cozy house in Crestfall Bay, now feeling more like a stage set where my children performed their roles of concerned offspring while plotting their inheritances. "I think a change of scenery might be exactly what I need, Dr. Valencia." When I returned home, I sat my children down in the kitchen, the same spot where I'd overheard them dividing my possessions. "I've made a decision," I announced. "I'm going to participate in a clinical trial at Meridian Medical Center. I'll be moving to an apartment near there for at least 6 months. Thackeray's brow furrowed. "That seems extreme. Your doctors here have everything under control." "And what about us?" Morwen added. "We've arranged our lives to help care for you here." I looked at my daughter, noting how she'd never once taken me to a chemotherapy appointment, claiming the hospital environment triggered her anxiety. I looked at my son, who spent more time examining my investment statements than inquiring about my comfort or well-being. "I need to do what's best for my health," I said firmly. "Lyra has offered to help me relocate. I leave in 3 days." "This is absurd," Thackeray protested. "You're in no condition to make such a significant decision. Perhaps we should consult with Fenwick about temporary guardianship given your mental state." The irony almost made me laugh. "My mental state is perfectly clear, Thackeray. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly than I do right now." The next few days were a flurry of tense interactions. My children alternated between guilt trips. "How could you abandon us during this family crisis?" Veiled threats. "We might need to take legal action for your own protection." And forced sentimentality. But who will maintain grandmother's garden if you're gone? The morning of my departure, I stood in my bedroom looking at the emerald. Pendant Morwen had so casually claimed for herself. I packed it carefully alongside select mementos and my most valuable first editions. The rest, the physical manifestation of a life spent nurturing two people who now saw me as nothing more than a balance sheet, I left behind. Lyra arrived with her practical sedan already prepared for the journey. Thackeray and Morwen stood, awkwardly in the driveway, finally realizing that they couldn't stop what was happening. "We're just worried about you," Morwen said, her voice smaller than usual. "This experimental treatment sounds risky." "Life is risky," I replied. "Having children is risky. Trusting people is risky. I've never shied away from risk before." I hugged them both, still loving them despite everything. They were my children, after all, products of both my care and my mistakes. Perhaps I had made them too comfortable, too entitled to the fruits of my labor. Perhaps this separation was necessary for all of us. As Lyra drove away from Crestfall Bay, I watched my children grow smaller in the side mirror, standing beside the house they assumed would soon be theirs to divide. They had no idea that while they were planning for my death, I was planning for my life, and for the lesson they so desperately needed to learn. "Are you sure about this?" Lyra asked, glancing at me with concern. I touched the folder containing my medical records and the documents from Fenwick. "I've never been more certain. Sometimes the greatest act of parental love isn't giving children what they want, but what they need. What my children needed was to understand the consequence of their actions. And if I survived this cancer, as I now fiercely intended to, they would learn that lesson in full." The apartment near Meridian Medical Center felt both foreign and liberating. It was small, just a one-bedroom unit in a nondescript building primarily housing medical staff and patients' families, but it was mine, untainted by the whispers of inheritance and the weight of disappointment. The walls were a sterile white. That reminded me of hospital corridors, but I'd brought a few of my botanical illustrations to add warmth. My favorite piece, a detailed study of coastal wildflowers from the cliffs of Crestfall Bay, now hung opposite my bed where I could see it first thing each morning, a reminder of strength and resilience. Dr. Valencia had warned me that the experimental protocol would be grueling. "We'll be combining targeted immunotherapy with modified radiation techniques," she explained during my orientation. "The side effects can be severe, but we've seen remarkable tumor reduction in patients with your genetic profile." What she hadn't mentioned was the isolation. Though Lyra visited when she could, the 3-hour drive made her visits infrequent. My days fell into a monotonous rhythm of treatment, recovery, and preparation for the next round. The other trial, participants became my community. Faces I recognized in waiting rooms, sharing knowing glances that communicated more than words ever could. We were all gambling with time, betting painful presents against possible futures. 2 weeks into my stay, the first message arrived from Thackeray. It was brief, almost clinical. "Fenwick says you've made changes to your estate planning. We need to discuss this as a family." I didn't respond. 3 days later, Morwen called. Her voice carried that forced cheerfulness she used with difficult clients. "Mom, we're worried sick. The house seems so empty without you. Have you thought about when you might come home? This treatment center can't possibly provide the personal care that your family can." "I'm doing well here," I replied simply. "The medical team is excellent." "But what about emotional support? You need your children around you during this time." I almost laughed. "I'm surrounded by people fighting the same battle, Morwen. There's a special kind of understanding in that." Her tone shifted subtly. "Thackeray tried to access your investment accounts to handle some of your expenses while you're away, but there seems to be some problem with the authorization." "There's no problem," I said. "I've made arrangements for my expenses." "But he's always helped manage your finances. Why would you change that now when you're ill?" Perhaps because I'm ill, I've become more particular about who manages what. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Morwen promising to visit soon, a promise I knew she wouldn't keep. The drive was too long, her schedule too busy, the medical environment too triggering for her sensitive constitution. The twins' messages increased in frequency and urgency over the following weeks. They discovered that I'd removed them as beneficiaries from my life insurance policy. They learned that the ownership of the Osprey Cove cabin had been transferred into a trust with conditions they couldn't decipher. They realized that my most valuable first editions were no longer in the library where they'd always been displayed. Each discovery brought a new wave of thinly veiled concern. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The stress of your diagnosis is affecting your judgment. We're only trying to protect your interests." The irony wasn't lost on me. My children, who had been so eager to divide my assets while I was supposedly dying, were now desperate to protect those same assets now that they sensed them slipping away. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening at Meridian. The experimental treatment was working. After 2 months, my scans showed significant tumor reduction. My blood work reflected improvements across all markers. Dr. Valencia was cautiously optimistic. "You're responding exceptionally well," she told me during our review session. "If this continues, we might be looking at complete remission." I sat in stunned silence, having prepared myself for an entirely different outcome. "What happens then?" I finally asked. "Then you get to decide what kind of life you want to live with your second chance," she replied with a gentle smile. That night, lying in my small apartment, I contemplated Dr. Valencia's words. What kind of life did I want? For so long, my existence had been defined by motherhood, by providing for the twins, by making their lives easier, often at the expense of my own comfort and security. I'd poured everything into them, my time, my energy, my financial resources, believing I was building a legacy of love and mutual support. Now I understood that I'd built something else entirely, a sense of entitlement so profound that my children viewed my possessions as extensions of their own, my life as a prelude to their inheritance, my death as an inconvenient transitional period to be expedited if possible. The realization was both heartbreaking and clarifying. If I survived, and increasingly it seemed I might, I would need to redefine these relationships on entirely new terms. The next morning, I received an email from Finwick. He'd been contacted by a lawyer representing Thackeray and Morwen, inquiring about the possibility of challenging my recent estate changes on grounds of diminished capacity due to my illness. Finwick, to his credit, had defended my mental competence vigorously, but he warned that the twins might escalate their efforts. I forwarded the email to Lyra with a simple message. "Now we know where we stand." Her reply came within minutes. "I never wanted to be right about this." As my health improved, I began exploring the city surrounding Meridian Medical Center. It was larger and more vibrant than Crestfall Bay, with museums, botanical gardens, and a thriving arts district. During my stronger days, I'd visit galleries or sit in parks with my sketchpad, capturing the unfamiliar flora in delicate pencil lines. I joined a support group for cancer patients where, for the first time, I spoke openly about my children's behavior and my own role in enabling it. "You gave them too much," said Imani, a breast cancer survivor with eyes that missed nothing. "Children need to fall sometimes to learn how to pick themselves up." "I was compensating," I admitted. "Their father left when they were toddlers. I wanted to make sure they never felt the lack of him." "And instead, they learned to take you for granted," Imani replied. "That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to correct it now." 3 months into my treatment, I received an unexpected visitor. I returned from an appointment to find Thackeray sitting in the lobby of my apartment building, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, as if he'd driven straight through without stopping. "Mom," he said, rising quickly, "we need to talk. I led him up to my apartment, noticing how his eyes assessed the modest furnishings, the lack of luxury or space. His gaze lingered on my botanical illustrations. "You brought those with you," he observed. "Just a few favorites." He sat stiffly on the small sofa, declining my offer of tea. "Mom, what's going on? You've frozen us out of everything. Your medical decisions, your finances, your life. We're your children." "Yes, you are," I agreed, sitting across from him. "And as your mother, I'm making decisions that I believe are necessary." Necessary? How is cutting us off from information about your condition necessary? How is changing your estate planning without consulting us necessary? "Without consulting you?" I repeated, letting the absurdity of his entitlement hang in. The air between us. "Thackeray, my estate planning is not a family democracy. It's my life's work to distribute as I see fit." His face flushed. "That's not what I meant. We're concerned about your judgment given your condition." "My condition is improving," I said calmly. "My oncologist is very pleased with my progress." This visibly startled him. "Improving? But Dr. Thorne said—" Dr. Thorne was working, with limited information. The treatment protocol here is experimental and showing remarkable results. Thackeray fell silent, and I could almost see the calculations behind his eyes, revising timelines, reconsidering strategies, adjusting expectations. That's wonderful news," he finally said, though his tone lacked genuine enthusiasm. "Yes, it is. I may live for many more years, Thackeray. Years in which I intend to manage my own affairs." He shifted uncomfortably. "No one's suggesting otherwise, but you've always involved us in your financial decisions before. You've always been generous with your resources." "And that will continue," I said, "but on new terms." "What terms?" I smiled. "Terms that recognize that my possessions are mine until I choose to share them, not pre-allocated assets in a distribution plan you and your sister have already determined." His expression froze. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," I replied softly. "I think you know exactly what I mean." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and defensive rebuttals. Finally, Thackeray stood, smoothing his wrinkled shirt in a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache despite everything. "You should come home," he said. "This place isn't suitable for recovery. The house in Crestfall Bay has always been your sanctuary." "I'll return when I'm ready," I answered. "For now, I'm exactly where I need to be." After he left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, turning our conversation over in my mind. He hadn't once asked how I was feeling. He hadn't inquired about my treatment experience or expressed genuine joy at my improving prognosis. His concern remained fixated on access to my home, my finances, my decisions. The next day, I called Fenwick and instructed him to proceed with the final changes to my estate plan. The trust funds I had established for the twins would be formally dissolved, replaced with a new arrangement that would fundamentally change our relationship. A week later, Morwen finally made the journey to Meridian. Unlike her brother, she arrived with an armful of gifts: organic bath products, luxury pajamas, gourmet chocolates I couldn't eat due to dietary restrictions from my treatment. "The place looks cozy," she said, her gaze skimming over my modest accommodations with barely concealed disapproval. "But it must be so depressing, being surrounded by illness all the time." "Actually, I find it inspiring," I replied. "Everyone here is fighting for their future. There's a remarkable energy in that collective determination." She settled onto the sofa, arranging herself artfully as she always did, mindful of the impression she created. "Thackeray said you're responding well to treatment. That's wonderful, Mom. We've been so worried." I noted how she glanced at my art supplies on the small dining table, my laptop open to a banking website, searching for clues about my activities and plans. The prognosis is much more positive now, I confirmed. Dr. Valencia believes I might achieve complete remission. That's amazing, she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. So you'll be coming home soon? Eventually. I'm required to stay near Meridian for ongoing monitoring, even after the active treatment phase concludes. Morwen nodded, then delicately approached her real agenda. Mom, I need to discuss something important with you. My business is at a critical growth point, but I need capital to expand. I've found the perfect location for a second studio, but the lease requires a substantial deposit. How substantial? I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. $75,000, she admitted. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's an investment in the future of holistic healing arts. The return potential is enormous. This was the same pitch I'd heard for years, always a critical juncture, always requiring immediate investment, always promising incredible returns that somehow never materialized. Morwen's business remained perpetually on the verge of breakthrough success that was always just one more cash infusion away. Have you approached a bank? I asked. She blinked in surprise. A bank? Mom, you know traditional lenders don't understand. Holistic businesses. They want revenue projections and client retention metrics that don't capture the true value of wellness services. They want evidence that their investment will be repaid, I corrected gently, as would any investor. I'm not asking for an investor, she said, frustration edging into her voice. I'm asking for my mother's support, like you've always given before. I regarded her thoughtfully. Morwen had my artistic sensibility, but none of my practicality. She moved through life expecting the world to accommodate her vision, regardless of financial realities. I'm not in a position to provide that level of funding right now, I said. My medical expenses are substantial, and I need to ensure my own financial security given my health situation. But Thackeray said you've been moving money around, changing accounts. Surely you have access to funds. I've been consolidating and simplifying my finances. Yes. That doesn't mean I have $75,000 available for a business expansion with no clear return timeline. Morwen's carefully cultivated composure cracked. You've never questioned my business decisions before. You've always believed in my vision. I still believe in your talent, I assured her. But I've enabled a pattern that isn't serving either of us well. You're 32, Morwen. It's time for your business to stand on its own merit, without continuous infusions from my savings. She stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Is this because of what Thackeray and I said about your emerald pendant? Because that was just a casual conversation. We weren't seriously dividing your things. So she knew I'd overheard them. The knowledge hung between us, acknowledged but not addressed directly. This isn't about jewelry, I said quietly. This is about recognizing that my resources are finite and that I've spent too many years prioritizing everyone's needs above my own. So, now that you're sick, you're suddenly becoming selfish? She demanded, tears springing to her eyes. After everything we've done to support you through this. The unfairness of her accusation was breathtaking. I couldn't recall a single concrete way either of my children had supported me through my illness, beyond occasional phone calls and performative concerns, expressed primarily to mutual acquaintances. I think it would be best if you left now, I said, rising from my chair. We're both tired, and this conversation isn't productive. You're choosing money over your relationship with your children, she said, gathering her purse with trembling hands. I never thought you'd become this person. After she left, I sat down at my small desk and began writing 2 letters, one to Thackeray and one to Morwen. The words came slowly, painfully, but with absolute clarity. I was done funding adult children, who viewed my resources as their entitlement. I was done sacrificing my security for their convenience. Most importantly, I was done pretending that their behavior was motivated by love rather than expectation. The following week brought another breakthrough in my treatment. The latest scans showed my tumors had reduced by nearly 80% from their original size. My energy was returning, my appetite improving. Dr. Valencia was now openly optimistic. "You're our star patient," she said during our review. "If things continue this way, we might be looking at a full recovery rather than just management." "What are the chances of recurrence?" I asked. "There are no guarantees with cancer," she admitted. "But with ongoing monitoring and maintenance therapy, your odds are better than most. You could have many healthy years ahead." Many healthy years. The prospect was both exhilarating and daunting. I had been preparing to die, arranging my affairs with the expectation of a limited timeline. Now I needed to plan for living, for creating a future that honored my second chance. That evening, I received a message from Lyra that changed everything. She had been keeping an eye on my house in Crestfall Bay, collecting mail and checking that everything remained in order. Her text was brief but alarming. "Something's happening at your house. Boxes being loaded into trucks. Should I intervene?" I called her immediately. "What exactly are you seeing?" "Professional movers," she reported. "They're packing up artwork, books, furniture. Thackeray and Morwen are both here directing them." My hands shook with sudden fury. "Do you still have the spare key I gave you?" "Yes. Go inside. Tell them you're acting as my representative, and that they have no authorization to remove anything from the premises. If they continue, call the police and report a theft in progress. I'll contact Fenwick immediately." The next hour was a blur of urgent calls and legal maneuverings. Fenwick confirmed what I already knew. My children had no legal right to remove belongings from my home without explicit permission. He dispatched a colleague to the scene while simultaneously preparing an emergency injunction. Lyra kept me updated through terse messages. Police arrived. Movers stopped work. Thackeray claiming miscommunication. Morwen crying. Officers taking inventory of items already loaded. By nightfall, the situation had been contained. The attempted clearing of my home had been halted, though not before several valuable items, including my grandmother's antique writing desk and a collection of first-edition poetry volumes, had been loaded onto trucks. The police had documented everything and ensured nothing left the property. Fenwick called with the aftermath report. "Your children are claiming they were simply securing valuable items out of concern they might be stolen while the house stood empty. They insist they plan to store everything safely until your return." "And you believe that?" I asked. His silence was answer enough. "What happens now?" I pressed. "That depends on what you want to do," he replied carefully. "This could be handled as a criminal matter, or we could address it through civil channels. Or you could choose to accept their explanation and move forward." I closed my eyes, visualizing my home being systematically emptied, my children directing strangers to pack away pieces of my life, while I fought for that very life in a hospital 3 hours away. "File whatever legal paperwork is necessary to formally document this incident," I instructed. "I don't want criminal charges, but I want this behavior on record. And Fenwick, it's time to implement the final changes to my estate plan. All of them. Are you certain? Once done, this will fundamentally alter your financial relationship with your children." "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. "They've made their choices. Now I'm making mine." The next morning, I requested an extended meeting with Dr. Valencia. I needed to understand exactly what my future might look like, what limitations I might face, what ongoing care would be required, what lifestyle adjustments would be necessary. I needed to plan for a life I hadn't expected to have. As we reviewed my treatment protocol and follow-up care requirements, I felt a strange sense of empowerment replacing the fear that had dominated my existence since my diagnosis. I wasn't just surviving cancer. I was reclaiming my autonomy from all the forms of malignancy that had invaded my life, including the toxic patterns I'd established with my children. "You seem different today," Dr. Valencia observed. "More focused." "I'm making decisions I should have made long ago," I replied. "Cancer has a way of clarifying priorities." She nodded in understanding. Many patients find that the disease forces them to confront issues they've been avoiding. Sometimes that's the unexpected gift within the suffering, the permission to finally put yourself first. That afternoon, I received confirmation from Fenwick that all the legal changes had been implemented. The trust funds I had established for the twins had been formally dissolved. The significant inheritance they had been anticipating, and apparently attempting to accelerate through their recent actions, was now restructured into a completely different arrangement. I then drafted an email to my children, copying Fenwick to ensure there could be no claims of misunderstanding or manipulation later. "Thackeray and Morwen, yesterday's events at my home have made it necessary for me to clarify several matters regarding my estate and our future relationship. Effective immediately, I have dissolved the trust funds previously established for your benefit. The assets from these trusts have been redirected into accounts solely under my control. My estate planning has been completely restructured to reflect my current priorities and values. I have always supported you both, emotionally, practically, and financially, to an extent that I now recognize was neither sustainable for me nor beneficial for your development as independent adults. That arrangement ends today. I am recovering from my illness. My prognosis is now far more positive than initially expected. I intend to use my remaining years, which may be many, living according to my own wishes rather than in service to your expectations. You are my children, and despite everything, I love you. That will never change. But love should not require the sacrifice of one's dignity, security, or self-respect. When you are ready to establish a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, I will welcome that conversation. Until then, I ask that you do not attempt to contact me or access my property without explicit permission. Fenwick will serve as intermediary for any necessary communications. I hope that one day you will understand that this decision, painful as it may be for all of us, comes from a place of clarity rather than cruelty. Mom." I read the message 3 times before pressing send, each word a stone in the foundation of my new life. A life where I would no longer be defined solely by what I gave to others, but also by what I preserved for myself. The response was swift and predictable. Morwen called repeatedly until I blocked her number. Thackeray sent a series of increasingly formal emails questioning my mental capacity and threatening legal action. Friends from Crestfall Bay reported that the twins were telling anyone who would listen about their mother's personality change due to cancer treatment, her manipulation by medical staff, her abandonment of family. I let them talk. After a lifetime of protecting my children from consequences, I was finally allowing them to experience the natural results of their actions. It was perhaps the most honest expression of parental love I had ever offered them. 6 months after beginning the experimental treatment protocol, I received the news I had scarcely dared to hope for. Complete remission. My cancer was gone, not just reduced or managed, but absent from my body according to every test and scan available. "This doesn't mean you're cured," Dr. Valencia cautioned. "We'll need vigilant monitoring, and there's always a possibility of recurrence. But right now, at this moment, you are cancer-free." I sat in her office, tears streaming down my face, overcome by the magnitude of the moment. I had prepared to die, had felt the proximity of my own end, had heard my children planning for my absence, and now I was being granted a continuation, not just of existence, but of possibility. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed when first learning the treatment was working. Dr. Valencia smiled. "Now you live, Alawan, however you choose." Living became an act of rebellion. Every morning I woke in my small apartment near Meridian Medical Center. I savored the quiet revelation that I was still here, still breathing, still creating a future that no one had anticipated, least of all my children. My calendar once, filled with treatment appointments and medication schedules, now contained different entries: art classes at the local community center, coffee meetings with fellow survivors from my support group, consultations with financial advisors about how best to restructure my life. My remission status required monthly follow-up appointments, and Dr. Valencia had made it clear that vigilance would be my constant companion for years to come. The cancer may be gone, she'd warned, but the experience of cancer will shape the rest of your life. Use it as a compass, not an anchor. I took her words to heart, allowing my brush with mortality to guide my decisions rather than weigh them down. The first major choice was whether to return to Crestfall Bay. My home there held decades of memories, my garden, my studio space, but it also contained the ghosts of betrayal, the echoes of conversations never meant for my ears. After much consideration, I decided to split my time. I would keep the house in Crestfall Bay, but also purchase a small condominium in Meridian City, closer to my medical team and the community of survivors who had become a vital support system during treatment. The dual residences would provide both continuity and fresh beginnings, a perfect metaphor for this unexpected chapter of my life. The real estate agent who helped me find my condominium, a former oncology nurse named Daphne, became an unexpected ally in my transformation. She understood the practical concerns of someone living in the shadow of cancer, the importance of proximity to medical facilities, the need for a maintenance-free living situation in case of illness recurrence, the value of community resources. Most of my clients are either entering treatment or leaving it, she explained as we toured a light-filled corner unit on the 6th floor of a modern building. Either way, they're looking for a place that accommodates uncertainty without being defined by it. The condominium was smaller than my house in Crestfall Bay, but felt expansive in its possibilities. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city park below, where the changing seasons would play out in full color. The kitchen was modest but efficient, with space for the herb garden I'd always maintained. Most importantly, the second bedroom could be converted into a studio where I could continue my botanical illustrations, work that had supported me financially, but also sustained me spiritually through the darkest days of my diagnosis and treatment. I made an offer the same day, pulling funds from the accounts I had so carefully protected from my children's preemptive inheritance plans. The transaction was completed within weeks, and I found myself the owner of a new home that contained no memories, no disappointments, no betrayals, only possibility. As I furnished the space with a mixture of new pieces and select treasures from my Crestfall Bay home, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in years: lightness. For decades, my existence had been weighed down by responsibility. To my children, to my work, to the expectations I had placed upon myself as a single mother determined to compensate for an absent father. Now, those burdens were lifting, not because I had abandoned my responsibilities, but because I was finally acknowledging that my first responsibility was to myself. Throughout this transition, communication from my children arrived in predictable waves. Initially, there were frantic attempts at contact, phone calls, emails, even a few unexpected visits to my temporary apartment near the medical center, thankfully intercepted by building security. Then came the legal maneuvers, with Thackeray engaging an attorney to explore the possibility of challenging my mental competence and the changes to my estate planning. These efforts faltered quickly when my medical team provided unequivocal testimony about my cognitive clarity and decisional capacity. The third phase was perhaps the most insidious: the campaign for sympathy. Friends and acquaintances from Crestfall Bay reported that Thackeray and Morwen were portraying themselves as victims of a medical tragedy. Not my cancer, but the personality changes and paranoia they claimed had resulted from my treatment. According to their narrative, I had abandoned my devoted children just when they were making sacrifices to care for me, all due to medication-induced delusions about their intentions. They're telling everyone you've fallen under the influence of some experimental drug regimen, reported Lyra during one of her visits to my new condominium. Apparently, you're now viewing normal family dynamics through a lens of suspicion and ingratitude. I placed the teacup I was holding carefully on its saucer, making an effort to control the tremor in my hands, a lingering side effect of treatment. Not anger, though the distinction hardly mattered in that moment. Normal family dynamics, I repeated. Is that what we call adult children dividing their living mother's possessions while she undergoes cancer treatment? Lyra's expression was grim. Most people don't know that part, of course. They're very selective about the narrative they're sharing. And how many people are believing them? Some, she admitted. Those who don't know you well, or who've only ever seen you through the lens of motherhood. But others are skeptical. Your friend Cordelia from the garden club told them quite directly that she's known you for 20 years, and you've never been anything but level-headed, even during your divorce from their father. I smiled at the thought of Cordelia, 87, years old and ferocious in her loyalties, defending me to my children. And what did they say to that? Thackeray suggested that her advancing age might be clouding her judgment, which didn't go over well. I could imagine. Cordelia wielded her garden shears with the precision of a surgeon and the authority of a general. Suggesting she was losing her faculties was a tactical error Thackeray would regret. They'll exhaust themselves eventually, I said, though whether I was reassuring Lyra or myself remained unclear. When their narrative doesn't produce the results they want, they'll try something else or move on. And what if they don't? What if they escalate? I considered this, turning the possibility over in my mind like a strange artifact from another life. Then I'll deal with that too. I survived cancer, Lyra. I can certainly survive the tantrums of adults who've been told no for the first time in their lives. My confidence was genuine, if perhaps premature. The following week, I received a message that tested my newfound resolve. It came not from my children directly, but from Roscoe, my ex-husband and the twins' father, who had been largely absent from their lives since walking out when they were toddlers. His email arrived on a Tuesday morning as I was preparing to meet with the contractor who would be converting my second bedroom into a studio space. The subject line was simple. The kids are worried about you. I nearly deleted it unread, but curiosity won out over caution. The message itself was brief, almost perfunctory. Elowyn, Thackeray, and Morwen have been in touch about your health situation. They're concerned about some radical changes in your behavior following your cancer treatment. While I've respected the boundaries of our separation all these years, I feel obligated as their father to understand what's happening. Could we meet to discuss the situation? Roscoe. 3 decades of minimal communication, of birthdays and graduations missed, of child support payments that arrived sporadically when they arrived at all. And now he felt obligated, as their father, to intervene. The audacity was breathtaking. I composed several responses in my mind, each more scathing than the last, before settling on a reply that matched his brevity without mirroring his presumption. Roscoe, my health situation is improving, thank you for asking. Any concerns about changes in my behavior should be directed to my medical team, who can confirm my cognitive and psychological wellness. There is nothing to discuss. Elowyn. I sent the email and immediately blocked his address, refusing to be drawn into whatever misguided rescue mission my children had enlisted him to perform. Their attempt to manipulate the situation through their absent father revealed just how desperate they had become, and how little they truly knew me if they thought this approach would succeed. That evening, I attended my weekly support group at the Meridian Cancer Resource Center. Our circle had shrunk slightly as a few members completed their treatments and returned to their regular lives. while others had not been as fortunate in their outcomes. Those of us who remained had formed bonds that transcended the usual social connections. We had seen each other at our most vulnerable, had witnessed each other's fears and triumphs, had held space for grief and hope in equal measure. I hadn't initially planned to share the latest developments with my children, feeling that their behavior was somehow a failure of my parenting, rather than a reflection of their choices. But as our facilitator, Julian, guided the conversation toward the topic of relationships after cancer, I found myself speaking about Roscoe's unexpected message and what it represented. "They're trying to use my ex-husband to undermine my autonomy," I explained to the circle of understanding faces. "They've gone from direct confrontation to legal challenges to public sympathy campaigns, and now they're recruiting the father who abandoned them to question my mental stability." Imani, whose sharp insights had become a cornerstone of our group, shook her head. "They're escalating because nothing else has worked. Each failure forces them to reach for more extreme measures." "Exactly," agreed Terrence, a retired psychology professor with lymphoma. "In behavioral terms, they're experiencing extinction burst, the intensification of a behavior when it stops producing the expected reward. It typically gets worse before it disappears entirely." "So I just need to outlast the burst?" I asked. "That's part of it," he replied thoughtfully. "But you also need to ensure you're not inadvertently reinforcing the behavior along the way. Any response that engages with their narrative, whether to defend yourself or correct their misrepresentations, feeds the dynamic." "Complete disengagement," suggested Sarah, a young mother fighting breast cancer. "That's what worked with my toxic in-laws. I stopped explaining, stopped defending, stopped participating in the drama entirely." "Gray rock method," nodded Terrence. "Become so uninteresting, so unreactive, that they can't sustain their emotional investment in the conflict." I considered their advice, wondering if I had the discipline to implement such a strategy. My entire relationship with my children had been characterized by emotional responsiveness to their needs, their desires, their crises, both real and manufactured. Could I really transform those deeply ingrained patterns? "I'm not sure I know how to be unresponsive to them," I admitted. "Even my anger is a form of engagement." Julian leaned forward, his expression compassionate but firm. "Perhaps the question isn't whether you can be unresponsive, but whether you're willing to prioritize your recovery, both physical and emotional, over their demands for attention and resources." His framing resonated in a way the tactical advice hadn't. This wasn't about techniques for managing difficult people. It was about honoring my healing process and protecting the hard-won clarity that my cancer journey had provided. "Yes," I said with quiet certainty. "I am willing to prioritize my recovery. I've earned that right." The conversation shifted to other members' experiences, but Julian's question stayed with me, becoming a touchstone for the decisions that followed. Each time I found myself tempted to respond to provocations from my children, the public narratives, the manipulative outreach through mutual friends, the occasional direct messages that slipped through my filters, I returned to that central commitment. I will prioritize my recovery. This clarity served me well when, 3 weeks after Roscoe's email, I received notice that my children had filed a formal petition for guardianship, claiming that my cancer treatment had caused cognitive impairment, rendering me incapable of managing my own affairs. The legal filing included affidavits from distant acquaintances attesting to my erratic behavior and paranoid tendencies, along with selective excerpts from medical literature about the potential cognitive effects of certain chemotherapy regimens. Finwick called the moment the petition was served. "This is aggressive," he said, not bothering with preliminaries. "They're attempting an end run around your autonomy by having you declared incompetent." "Can they succeed?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Not with the medical documentation we have," he assured me. Dr. Valencia and your entire treatment team at Meridian are prepared to testify about your cognitive function and decisional capacity. Your regular participation in support groups, art classes, and financial planning meetings all demonstrate clear functional ability. Then why attempt something so obviously doomed to fail? Fenwick hesitated, and I could almost see him choosing his words carefully. In my experience, these extreme measures often aren't about the stated goal, but about forcing engagement. They can't reach you directly, so they're using the legal system to compel your attention and response. His assessment aligned perfectly with what Terence had called extinction burst, the desperate escalation of behavior when familiar patterns stop producing the desired outcome. My children couldn't access my finances or manipulate my decisions, so they were attempting to remove my decision-making authority entirely. How should we respond? I asked. Forcefully and comprehensively, he replied without hesitation. We don't just defeat this petition, we crush it so thoroughly that they cannot attempt this route again. I want sanctions for frivolous filing, costs awarded to you, and a clear judicial statement about your competence that will preclude any similar future actions. His strategy made perfect sense from a legal perspective, but I found myself hesitating. That feels vindictive. It's protective, Fenwick countered. This isn't just about this specific petition. It's about establishing boundaries that will prevent future encroachments. Sometimes the clearest boundaries require the firmest enforcement. I knew he was right, but the prospect of such a confrontational approach still troubled me. Throughout my life, I had been the mediator, the peacemaker, the one who absorbed discomfort to spare others conflict. Even now, facing this outrageous attempt to strip me of my autonomy, some part of me wanted to find a gentler resolution. Let me think about it, I said finally. I'll call you tomorrow with my decision. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced the length of my new condominium, watching the city lights flicker below, trying to reconcile my instinctive desire for reconciliation with the clear evidence that my children viewed me not as a person deserving of dignity and respect, but as a resource to be controlled and exploited. I found myself in front of the large picture window, staring at my own reflection overlaid against the urban landscape beyond. Who was this woman looking back at me? Not the accommodating mother, who had spent decades prioritizing her children's desires above her own needs. Not the artist who had channeled her creative energy into supporting others rather than pursuing her own vision. Not the cancer patient who had prepared to die while her children divided her possessions. This was someone new, a woman who had faced death and discovered, in that confrontation, the true value of her own life. A woman who understood, finally, that setting boundaries wasn't an act of cruelty, but an expression of self-respect. A woman who recognized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for others is to stop enabling their destructive behaviors, even when that means allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. By morning, my path was clear. I called Fenwick and gave him simple instructions. Respond with everything we have. No holds barred. The legal proceedings that followed were both exhaustive and exhausting. My medical team produced comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations demonstrating my intact cognitive function. Financial advisors testified about my rational decision-making regarding investments and property purchases. Friends and colleagues provided statements about my consistent behavior and sound judgment. Most devastating to my children's case, however, was the evidence I had been quietly gathering since that first overheard conversation. With Lyra's help, I had documented every attempt by Thackeray and Morwen to access my accounts without authorization. I had saved every message revealing their true motivations. I had preserved the police report from their unauthorized attempt to remove items from my home. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Justice Honorina Winters, reviewed the evidence with increasing expressions of disbelief and disapproval. When my children's attorney attempted to suggest that my suspicious record-keeping was itself evidence of paranoia, Justice Winters cut him off mid-sentence. "Counsel, let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice sharp with authority. "Documenting actual attempts to misappropriate one's assets is not paranoia, it's prudence. The evidence before me suggests that Ms. Blackthorne's concerns about her children's intentions were not only reasonable, but entirely justified by their subsequent actions." The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Additionally, Justice Winters granted my request for a protective order prohibiting Thackeray and Morwen from making further legal claims regarding my competence without substantial new medical evidence and prior judicial review. Finally, she ordered them to pay all legal costs associated with the proceedings, a sum that would significantly impact their financial situations. As we left the courtroom, Fenwick couldn't contain his satisfaction. "That was as complete a victory as I've seen in 30 years of practice," he said, a rare smile crossing his typically stoic features. Justice Winters essentially gave them a legal spanking. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a profound sadness washing over me as I watched my children huddled with their attorney at the far end of the courthouse corridor. They looked diminished somehow, Thackeray's usual confident posture replaced by a defeated slump, Morwen's carefully maintained poise crumbling into visible distress. They really believed they would win, I realized aloud. They genuinely thought they could convince a court that I was incompetent simply because I stopped financing their lives. "Entitlement distorts reality," Fenwick observed. "They've constructed a narrative where your resources belong to them by right, so any assertion of your autonomy must represent some form of impairment or undue influence." "Will this be the end of it?" I asked, not entirely sure what answer I was hoping for. "Legally, yes, I believe so. They've exhausted their viable options and suffered significant consequences for this attempt. Emotionally?" He shrugged. "That depends on their capacity for self-reflection and growth." I nodded, watching as my children moved toward the exit without looking in my direction. Despite everything, I felt a pull toward them, the magnetic draw of maternal connection that had shaped my existence for over 3 decades. It would be so easy to call out, to offer comfort even now, to slip back into the familiar patterns of sacrifice and accommodation. Instead, I turned away and walked toward my own future, a future that would be defined by my choices rather than their expectations. If they wanted to be part of that future, they would need to accept me as I was now. A woman who valued herself enough to establish and maintain boundaries, who understood that true love required respect, not capitulation. The aftermath of the court case brought an unexpected calm. The aggressive tactics ceased, replaced by a tense silence that stretched across the weeks that followed. I used this period of relative peace to continue establishing my new life routines. I divided my time between my condominium in Meridian City and my house in Crestfall Bay, finding that each location nourished different aspects of my recovery. In Meridian, I immersed myself in the community of survivors I had come to treasure. I took studio art classes at the university, refining techniques I had developed through years of botanical illustration, but never had time to fully explore. I volunteered at the Cancer Resource Center, offering gentle guidance to newly diagnosed patients navigating the bewildering landscape of treatment options and insurance complications. During my visits to Crestfall Bay, I reconnected with the natural world that had always inspired my artwork. I tended my garden with renewed appreciation for growth and resilience. I reestablished connections with friends who had stood by me, despite my children's campaign to portray me as mentally compromised. I reclaimed spaces and relationships that had been overshadowed by family drama, finding joy in simple pleasures that had once seemed insignificant compared to the weight of maternal responsibility. Throughout this transitional period, I maintained my commitment to prioritizing recovery above all else. I declined invitations that felt draining rather than nourishing. I established clear boundaries with well-meaning friends who urged reconciliation with my children before I felt ready. I scheduled rest periods with the same diligence I had once applied to work deadlines and family obligations. Dr. Valencia, during my monthly checkups, noted the physical manifestations of these changes. "Your inflammatory markers are down," she observed during one visit. "Blood pressure is significantly improved. Even your sleep quality reports are better. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "I'm putting myself first," I told her. "It still feels strange sometimes, almost selfish." "It's not selfish to secure your own oxygen mask before helping others," she replied with the easy wisdom of someone who had guided countless patients through similar recalibrations. "It's necessary for survival." 3 months after the court case, as summer turned to autumn and the trees in the city park below my condominium blazed with color, I received an unexpected letter. The envelope bore Morwen's distinctive handwriting, but unlike previous communications, it carried no legal markings, no certified mail stamps, no indication of official business. It was simply a personal letter, the kind that had become increasingly rare in our digital age. I held it for several minutes, debating whether to open it or return it unopened. The latter would align with my strict boundaries, but something, intuition perhaps, or simply curiosity, prompted me to carefully slit the envelope and unfold the single sheet inside. Morwen's letter was brief, but unlike anything I had received from her in years. "Mom, I've written this letter a dozen times, each attempt feeling inadequate for what needs to be said. There's no excuse for how Thackeray and I have treated you. We became entitled to your generosity, then outraged when that entitlement was challenged. We saw your resources as extensions of our own, your boundaries as unreasonable restrictions, your self-advocacy as betrayal. The court case forced me to confront some ugly truths about myself, about the person I've become and the daughter I've failed to be. I've started therapy to understand why I believed I was entitled to your sacrifice, why I resented your independence so deeply, why I confused love with financial support. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I haven't earned either. I simply wanted you to know that I'm trying to understand what happened, and to become someone who won't repeat these patterns. Whether we ever rebuild our relationship or not, I owe you this effort." Morwen. I read Morwen's letter 7 times, searching for hidden agendas between the lines, looking for subtle manipulations or veiled demands. I found none. The words seemed genuine in their simplicity, unadorned by the emotional. Flourishes my daughter typically employed when attempting to persuade or charm. This was not the Morwen I had grown accustomed to, the perpetually struggling artist who viewed my resources as an extension of her birthright. This was someone new, or perhaps someone rediscovered. A glimpse of the thoughtful child who had existed before entitlement calcified into personality. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days while I considered my response. Part of me wanted to reach out immediately, to grasp this fragile tendril of connection before it withered. Another part, the part that had endured months of manipulation, legal harassment, and character assassination, counseled caution. Words were easy. Sustainable change required more than a single moment of clarity. On the 4th day, I composed a brief reply. "Morwen, thank you for your letter. Self-reflection is a difficult journey, and I respect your courage in beginning it. I wish you well with your therapy and your efforts toward growth." Mom. I kept my response deliberately, neutral, acknowledging her outreach without making promises or setting expectations. If Morwen was truly committed to understanding her behavior, she would recognize that rebuilding trust required patience and consistency, not immediate reconciliation. Thackeray, meanwhile, maintained his silence, whether from pride, shame, or strategic calculation. He made no attempt to contact me in the aftermath of the court's decisive ruling. Mutual acquaintances reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn from social circles in Crestfall Bay, focusing intensely on his financial consulting business to recoup the substantial costs of the failed legal maneuvers. Autumn progressed into winter, bringing crisp clarity to the air and a sense of suspended animation to my relationship with my children. The hostilities had ceased, but genuine connection remained distant, a possible future rather than a present reality. I used this period of relative calm to focus on my own healing, both physical and emotional. My monthly checkups with Dr. Valencia continued to show positive results. "Your body is responding beautifully to the maintenance therapy," she observed. During my December appointment, "Your immune markers are excellent and there's no evidence of recurrence. So I can reduce these visits to quarterly now?" I asked, hoping to gradually distance myself from the constant reminders of illness. She hesitated, tapping her pen against my chart. "I'd prefer to maintain monthly monitoring through the 1-year mark. Ovarian cancer can be insidious and your particular genetic profile suggests vigilance is warranted." I nodded, accepting her caution while silently acknowledging the irony. After fighting so hard to live, I was now impatient to move beyond the routines of survival and into the fullness of life after cancer. Dr. Valencia seemed to read my thoughts. "I know these appointments feel like dragging an anchor from your past," she said gently, "but think of them as insurance for your future, a small investment of time that protects everything you've fought to regain." Her framing helped me accept the ongoing medical oversight with better grace. I was no longer a passive recipient of care but an active participant in safeguarding my hard-won remission. This perspective shift extended beyond my physical health to my financial and emotional well-being as well. With Finwick's guidance, I continued restructuring my assets to ensure my long-term security while also creating mechanisms for potential legacy giving. The trust funds I had dissolved for my children were partially reconstituted as charitable foundations, focusing on areas that reflected my values: arts education for underserved communities, cancer research focused on late-stage treatments, and environmental conservation of coastal habitats, like those surrounding Crestfall Bay. These foundations can operate during your lifetime, with you as the primary director, Finwick explained during a planning session in his office. Eventually, if appropriate, your children could be invited to participate in governance roles, not as beneficiaries, but as stewards of philanthropic resources. "That's an elegantly constructive consequence," I observed, appreciating how the structure created possibility without guarantee. "They would need to demonstrate commitment to something beyond self-interest." Finwick nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It provides a pathway for them to earn back your trust through actions rather than words, while ensuring that your assets serve purposes you value regardless of their choices." As winter deepened, my dual living arrangement between Meridian City and Crestfall Bay revealed unexpected benefits. The rhythm of migration between my two homes created natural boundaries around my time and energy. In Meridian, I focused on my medical care, support group participation, and developing new skills through university classes. In Crestfall Bay, I nurtured friendships, tended my garden during brief, mild spells, and reconnected with my artistic practice in my familiar studio space. The separation also provided clarity about which residents of my hometown were true friends and which had been merely social acquaintances maintained through proximity and habit. Some people drifted away, uncomfortable with the public rift between me and my children, or unwilling to navigate the social complexities of divided loyalties. Others, like Cordelia from the Garden Club, became even more present in my life, offering unambiguous support and practical assistance. "People show you who they are when things get messy," Cordelia declared during one of our regular tea sessions in her Victorian home overlooking the bay. At 87, she had survived her husband, 2 children, and countless fair-weather friends, leaving her with little patience for social niceties that masked deeper truths. All those folks who can't decide whether to believe you or your children, they've decided more than they realize. I smiled at her characteristic bluntness. "How so?" If they're questioning whether you've suddenly gone irrational after decades of stability, they've already determined you're not worth the effort of deeper understanding. She poured more tea with hands that trembled slightly, but maintained surprising precision. Besides, I've known Thackeray and Morwen since they were in pinafores. That boy was counting pennies before he could count candles on his birthday cake. Her assessment, while harsh, carried the ring of truth. Thackeray had always approached relationships as transactions, measuring emotional investment against anticipated returns. Where had that orientation come from? Had I modeled it unknowingly through my own calculated sacrifices? Or had his father's? Abandonment created a fundamental insecurity that no amount of maternal devotion could counterbalance? These questions occupied my thoughts as winter gradually yielded to early spring. I found myself engaging more deeply with my personal history, not to assign blame, but to understand patterns that might still be operating in my present. This introspection led me to make an unexpected decision, one that surprised even Lyra, when I shared it over dinner at my Meridian condominium. "You're going to contact Roscoe?" she repeated, setting down her fork with deliberate care. "Your ex-husband who hasn't been meaningfully involved in your children's lives for 3 decades?" "Yes," I confirmed, understanding her concern but feeling increasingly certain about my course. "Not because I expect anything from him, but because I want to close that chapter properly." "What does properly mean in this context?" Lyra asked, her skepticism evident. "The man abandoned his family and then had the audacity to contact you when your children enlisted him in their campaign to control your assets. What closure could possibly come from re-engaging with him?" I considered her question carefully, trying to articulate the intuition that had been forming over months of reflection. "I think I've been carrying Roscoe's abandonment as my defining failure. The evidence that I wasn't enough to keep our family intact, the wound I tried to compensate for through excessive giving to our children." "That's his failure, not yours," Lyra pointed out. "Logically, yes," I agreed. "But emotionally? I've been trying to fix a broken foundation by constantly reinforcing the walls above it. I enabled Thackeray and Morwen's entitlement because their expectations of support eased my guilt about their father's absence. I became the parent who would never leave, never say no, never prioritize myself, as if that could somehow fill the void Roscoe created." Lyra's expression softened as understanding dawned. "So this isn't about Roscoe at all. It's about releasing yourself from the compensatory patterns his departure triggered." "Exactly. I need to face him not as the abandoned wife or the compensating mother, but as the woman I am now, someone who has confronted mortality and chosen life on her own terms." The meeting with Roscoe was arranged for a neutral location, a quiet cafe in a town halfway between Crestfall Bay and Meridian City. I arrived early, selecting a corner table that offered privacy without isolation. The Roscoe who walked through the door 30 minutes later was simultaneously familiar and unrecognizable. The essential architecture of his face unchanged but weathered by 3 decades of separate living. "Elawen," he said, his voice carrying the same resonant timbre I remembered. "You look well." "Cancer will do that for you," I replied with a small smile. "Clarifies priorities." He nodded awkwardly, settling into the chair across from me. Up close, I could see the years mapped more clearly. The creases around his eyes, the silver threading through his once uniformly dark hair, the slight softening along his jawline. Age had mellowed his striking features into something more approachable, less intimidating than the man whose departure had once shattered my world. "I was sorry to hear about your diagnosis," he offered. "Thackeray said it was serious." "It was. It is," I corrected myself. "I'm in remission, but ovarian cancer has a tendency to return. I'll be monitored closely for years." "And the treatments? They were successful?" "Yes, though not without cost." I gestured vaguely, encompassing both the physical toll and the relational fracturing that had followed. Which brings us to why we're here. The last time we spoke was when you reached out at our children's behest, suggesting my medical treatment had affected my judgment. He had the grace to look embarrassed. I shouldn't have inserted myself into that situation. It wasn't my place. No, it wasn't, I agreed. But it made me realize something important. For 30 years, I've been trying to compensate for your absence in our children's lives. I've enabled their sense of entitlement, their expectation of unlimited support, because I felt guilty that they didn't have two present parents. Roscoe's expression tightened. That's not fair, Elowen. You chose to raise them alone. I offered child support. Intermittently, I interjected. And this isn't about assigning blame. I'm not interested in revisiting old grievances or keeping score. I'm here because I'm finally ready to stop carrying the weight of your choice as my burden. He fell silent, studying me with newfound attention. You've changed. Yes, I acknowledged simply. Nearly dying tends to have that effect. What do you want from me? He asked finally. It was the question I had been waiting for. The one that would allow me to articulate the purpose of this meeting, both for him and for myself. Nothing, I replied. That's the point. I wanted to look you in the eyes and fully recognize that I no longer need anything from you. Not explanations, not apologies, not validation. Your departure was about your limitations, not my worth. My value doesn't depend on your presence or absence in my life. Roscoe shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this level of directness. I wasn't trying to hurt you when I left. I just wasn't ready for the responsibilities of parenthood, especially with Thackeray's health issues in those early years. I know, I said, surprising myself with the genuine absence of bitterness in my voice. You made the choice that seemed necessary for your survival at the time, just as I'm making choices now that are necessary for mine. And our children? What choices are you making about them? The question hung between us, laden with implications about loyalty, obligation, and the unspoken rules of parenthood. I'm choosing to love them without enabling them, I said carefully. I'm choosing to value myself as much as I value them. I'm choosing to make space for them to grow into adults who relate to me through respect rather than expectation. Roscoe nodded slowly, processing my words. They won't like those terms. No, I agreed. But they need them, perhaps more than they need the inheritance they were so eager to claim. We talked for another hour, covering territories both familiar and unexplored. Roscoe shared details of his life after our marriage, his second wife, their eventual divorce, his moderately successful career in commercial real estate. I spoke about my work as a botanical illustrator, my recent cancer journey, my rediscovered passion for creating art beyond scientific documentation. Neither of us mentioned reconciliation, understanding implicitly that our connection existed now only through the children we had created together. But as we prepared to leave, Roscoe paused, his expression thoughtful. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're right about Thackeray and Morwen. They've grown accustomed to equating love with financial support. That's partly my fault. I tried to ease my guilt through gifts and checks rather than presents. We both contributed to the pattern, I acknowledged, but they're adults now, responsible for their own choices and capable of creating new patterns if they're willing to do the work. And if they're not? I considered his question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. Then I will love them from a distance that protects my well-being while leaving space for their potential growth. As I drove back to Meridian City, that evening, I felt a subtle but significant shift in my emotional landscape. My conversation with Roscoe hadn't magically healed the wounds of abandonment or erased the complex legacy of our failed marriage. But it had allowed me to place those experiences in proper perspective, as formative chapters in my story rather than defining failures that required endless compensation. This reframing created new possibilities for my relationship with my children. If I was no longer driven by guilt over their father's absence, I could engage with them based on the present reality rather than historical deficits. I could love them without the compulsive need to prove that love through financial support or unlimited accommodation. The practical application of this insight came sooner than expected. 2 days after my meeting with Roscoe, I received an email from Thackeray, his first direct communication since the court case. The message was brief and uncharacteristically hesitant. "Mom, I understand you met with Dad recently. He reached out to tell me about your conversation and suggested I might want to reconsider my approach to our situation. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past months, especially since the court ruling. I realize my behavior has been inexcusable. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet for coffee sometime when you're next in Crestfall Bay. No agenda, no requests, just a conversation." Thackeray. I read the message several times, noting both what was present and what was absent. Unlike Morwen's letter, which had explicitly acknowledged specific behaviors and expressed commitment to personal growth through therapy, Thackeray's email remained vague in its accountability. He recognized his behavior as inexcusable, but didn't identify which actions fell into that category or why they were problematic. Still, it represented a significant departure from his previous stance of entitled indignation. The absence of demands or expectations suggested at least an intellectual recognition that our relationship needed to operate on new terms. I waited 24 hours before responding, using the time to clarify my own boundaries and intentions for any potential meeting. Finally, I composed a reply that balanced openness with caution. "Thackeray, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your willingness to reconsider our situation and would be open to meeting when I return to Crestfall Bay next week. I'll be at Cordelia's Tea House on Thursday at 2 p.m. if you'd like to join me." Mom. The proposed location was deliberate, a public place with positive associations for me, where Cordelia's watchful presence would provide both witness and buffer if needed. The schedule was equally intentional, offering a specific time rather than opening negotiations about when and where we might meet. Over the next week, I found myself experiencing a peculiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension about the wide upcoming meeting. Would Thackeray actually appear? Would he maintain this seemingly conciliatory approach, or would the conversation eventually circle back to financial matters? Was this genuine remorse or strategic recalibration after his legal options had been exhausted? I discussed these questions with my support group at the Meridian Cancer Resource Center, finding particular wisdom in Julian's gentle observation. "The beauty of your position now is that you don't have to decide in advance whether his intentions are pure. You can simply observe his behavior over time and adjust your engagement accordingly." Imani, as usual, offered a more direct perspective. "Trust is rebuilt through consistent actions, not single conversations. One coffee meeting doesn't erase months of attempting to declare you incompetent. Keep your expectations realistic and your boundaries firm." Armed with their insights, I traveled to Crestfall Bay the following week, settling into my house with a sense of homecoming that had grown stronger as the property reclaimed its identity as my space, rather than a contested asset. The garden was showing early signs of spring revival, with crocuses pushing through the cold earth and buds forming on the Japanese maple I had planted the year before my diagnosis. Thursday arrived with surprising swiftness. I chose my outfit. With deliberate care, a deep teal sweater that brought out the green in my eyes, comfortable slacks, and a silver pendant Lyra had given me to celebrate 6 months of remission. The overall effect was one of quiet confidence rather than defensiveness or fragility. Cordelia's tea house occupied the ground floor of her Victorian home, a charming space filled with mismatched antique furniture and the comforting scent of bergamot and freshly baked scones. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table near the bay window that offered views of the harbor beyond. Cordelia herself brought my usual Earl Grey with a knowing look. "He's already here," she murmured, gesturing discreetly toward the entrance where Thackeray stood, appearing uncharacteristically uncertain. "Arrived 10 minutes ago and has been pacing outside ever since. Want me to send him away?" "No," I replied, touched by her protective instinct. "But perhaps hover nearby for the first few minutes?" She nodded, her expression communicating that she'd be watching closely from behind the counter. Thackeray spotted me and approached slowly, his usually confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. He looked tired, I realized, the polished facade of the successful financial consultant showing subtle cracks around the edges. His expensive shirt was slightly wrinkled, his hair less precisely styled than his typical presentation. "Hello, Mom," he said, remaining standing until I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but not cold. "Would you like some tea?" He nodded, and Cordelia materialized beside our table as if summoned by the thought. "Darjeeling for me, please," he requested, then added belatedly, "if it's not too much trouble." Cordelia's eyebrows rose slightly at this uncharacteristic politeness from Thackeray, who had typically treated service staff with distracted indifference. "Coming right up," she replied, giving me a subtle look that communicated both surprise and continued vigilance. An awkward silence descended after she departed, both of us suddenly uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory of tentative reconnection. Thackeray broke the impasse first. "You look well," he observed. "Healthy. The treatments must have been successful." "They were," I confirmed. "I'm in remission, though still under close monitoring." That's wonderful news, Mom." "Truly." Another silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything unspoken, the overheard conversation about dividing my possessions, the attempts to access my accounts, the legal petition questioning my competence. "I don't know how to do this," Thackeray finally admitted, staring down at the tablecloth. "I've rehearsed what to say a dozen times, but now that I'm here, none of it seems adequate." "Perhaps start with what you hope to achieve from this conversation," I suggested gently. "What does a successful outcome look like to you?" He looked up, meeting my gaze directly for the first time since arriving. "I want to understand how we got here, how I became someone who would try to take control of his mother's assets while she was fighting cancer. I want to know if there's any way back from that kind of betrayal." The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the calculated approach I had half expected, designed to regain access to financial support through performative remorse. This was something more vulnerable, more genuine than anything I had heard from my son in years. "That's a brave starting point," I acknowledged. "And a complicated question." "I've been talking with a therapist," he said, the admission clearly difficult for someone who had always prided himself on self-sufficiency. "She suggested that my behavior might be rooted in early experiences of abandonment and insecurity when Dad left." Cordelia returned with his tea, placing it before him with a nod before retreating to her position behind the counter, still within eyesight but giving us privacy to continue our conversation. "That seems like a reasonable hypothesis," I said, carefully. "Your father's departure created wounds that I tried to heal through overcompensation, giving you and Morwen everything I could, often at my own expense. That pattern may have unintentionally taught you that love and financial support were synonymous." Thackeray nodded slowly. "The therapist said something similar. She suggested that when you stopped providing that support and began establishing boundaries, it felt like abandonment all over again." "That makes sense," I acknowledged, "though it doesn't excuse attempting to have me declared incompetent." His face flushed with visible shame. "No, nothing excuses that. It was monstrous, Mom. I can see that now. At the time, I somehow convinced myself it was for your protection. but that was just a convenient fiction to cover what was really happening. Which was panic, he admitted quietly. Pure panic that the safety net I'd always relied on was disappearing. When you got sick, I thought I'd finally have access to everything I believed was rightfully mine. When you recovered and started making independent decisions instead, I couldn't handle the loss of control. His candor was disarming. This wasn't the carefully constructed persona of Thackeray the financial consultant, always calculating optimal returns and managing impressions. This was a glimpse of the vulnerable child beneath the adult facade, the boy who had lost his father at 3 and spent a lifetime building defenses against further abandonment. Thank you for your honesty, I said. It helps me understand your perspective, even if I can't condone the actions that followed from it. I don't expect you to, he replied quickly. I wouldn't, in your position. I needed you to know that I'm trying to understand what happened and why. Not to excuse it, but to ensure I never repeat it. We talked for nearly 2 hours, moving beyond the initial awkwardness into territories we had never explored together. His early memories of his father's departure, my struggles as a single mother, the complicated dynamics that had shaped our family system. There were moments of painful recognition, occasional defensive reactions, and unexpected insights from both sides. Thackeray revealed that the court-ordered payment of legal fees had nearly bankrupted him, forcing him to downsize his living arrangements and reconsider his spending habits. Rather than bitter, he seemed almost grateful for the reset, describing it as a necessary reckoning with reality. I shared my own journey of reclaiming selfhood after cancer, the liberation that came with establishing boundaries, and my ongoing commitment to maintaining those boundaries, even as we explored potential reconciliation. As our conversation drew to a natural close, Thackeray hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout our meeting. Where do we go from here, Mom? Is there a path forward for us? I considered his question carefully, wanting to offer truth rather than false reassurance. I believe there can be, Thackeray, but it will need to be built on new terms. Trust that has been broken can't be instantly restored. It needs to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time. What would those actions look like? He asked. And I was struck by the genuine desire to understand rather than negotiate or manipulate. Respect for my boundaries, regular communication without hidden agendas, engagement with your own healing process through continued therapy, patience with my caution, I listed. And, perhaps most importantly, acceptance that our relationship moving forward will be based on emotional connection rather than financial support. He nodded slowly, absorbing each point. That seems fair. More than fair, given everything that's happened. As we prepared to leave, Thackeray reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching mine. A gesture of connection that respected my space, asking permission rather than assuming rights. Thank you for meeting with me today, he said, for listening, for being willing to consider a future where I might earn back your trust. I completed the connection, briefly covering his hand with mine. We're family, Thackeray. That hasn't changed, even if the nature of our relationship needed to evolve. Walking back to my house along the familiar coastal path, I felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside my hard-won boundaries. The conversation with Thackeray had been more genuine, more substantive than I had dared to hope. Combined with Morwen's letter a few months earlier, it suggested possibility, not for an immediate return to how things had been, but for the gradual cultivation of something healthier, more balanced, more honest. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of amber and rose, I recognized that my journey had come full circle in unexpected ways. What had begun with devastating betrayal during my cancer diagnosis had evolved through stages of awakening, resistance, and reclamation to arrive at a place of cautious healing. The cancer had forced me to confront my mortality, My children's behavior had compelled me to examine my identity beyond motherhood. My recovery had provided the opportunity to redefine all my relationships on more authentic terms. Each challenge had stripped away another layer of accommodation and self-neglect, revealing the woman I had always been beneath the roles I had played. My phone chimed softly with an incoming message. It was from Morwen. "I heard you met with Thackeray today. He said it went well. I'm glad. When you're ready, I'd like to have a similar conversation. No pressure, no timeline. I'm continuing my therapy and learning a lot about myself. Take all the time you need." I smiled at the respect for boundaries evident in her message. So different from the entitled demands that had characterized our interactions before my illness. Whether this represented lasting change or temporary adjustment remained to be seen, but it offered hope that the painful lessons of the past year had not been entirely in vain. I typed a simple reply. "Thank you, Morwen. I appreciate your patience and your commitment to growth. I'll let you know when I'm ready for that conversation." As darkness settled over Crestfall Bay, I made my way inside, turning on lamps that cast warm pools of light throughout my reclaimed space. My house no longer felt like contested territory or a repository of inheritance in waiting. It had returned to what it was always meant to be, my sanctuary, my canvas, my domain. Tomorrow, I would return to Meridian City for my monthly checkup with Dr. Valencia. We would review my scans and blood work, discuss adjustments to my maintenance therapy, and celebrate another milestone in my recovery. Then I would attend my support group, have dinner with Lyra, and work on the botanical illustrations for the book project I had recently committed to, a collection of coastal flora that had been on my artistic bucket list for years. My life was unfolding according to my choices rather than others' expectations. My calendar reflected my priorities rather than obligatory sacrifices. My resources supported my well-being rather than enabling my children's entitlement. And if Thackeray and Morwen proved through consistent actions that they were capable of relating to me as autonomous adults rather than entitled dependents, perhaps one day they would again have access to the trust funds I had dissolved, not as passive inheritors of wealth they viewed as their due, but as responsible stewards of resources meant to sustain values worth preserving. That decision, like all others moving forward, would be made not from guilt or obligation or fear, but from the clear-eyed wisdom of a woman who had stared down death, survived betrayal, and emerged with an unshakable commitment to living authentically for whatever time remained. 5 years had passed since that first tentative coffee meeting with Thackeray at Cordelia's tea house. The seasons had cycled repeatedly through their familiar patterns, carrying with them the steady rhythm of change and renewal. My remission had solidified into something my medical team cautiously referred to as sustained recovery, though they maintained their vigilance with regular screenings and blood work. Cancer, like trust once broken, required constant watchfulness. On this particular autumn morning, I stood before my bathroom mirror in my Meridian City condominium, examining my reflection with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. At 62, my face bore the evidence of battles fought and survived, fine lines around my eyes that deepened when I smiled, silver threading through my once uniformly dark hair, a certain weathered wisdom that hadn't been present before my illness. But there was vitality in my gaze that cancer had temporarily dimmed but never extinguished. My shoulders carried themselves differently now, not with the defensive hunch of someone expecting attack, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to defend her own worth. The mirror reflected not just physical healing, but emotional resurrection. My phone vibrated against the marble countertop, displaying a message from Morwen. "Final preparations complete. We're all set for tomorrow. Mom, I can't tell you how much this means." Tomorrow marked the 5-year anniversary of my remission diagnosis, a milestone my medical team had identified as significantly reducing the likelihood of recurrence. To celebrate, we had planned a gathering that would have been unthinkable during the tumultuous months following my treatment. Thackeray, Morwen, and I would be hosting an event at the Meridian City Art Center to launch the Blackthorn Family Foundation, the charitable entity that had emerged from the ashes of their dissolved trust funds. The journey to this moment had been neither linear nor simple. Following my initial meeting with Thackeray, months had passed before I felt ready to extend a similar invitation to Morwen. Her therapy had yielded genuine insights about her patterns of financial dependence and artistic self-sabotage, but the transition from insight to changed behavior required sustained effort that tested her commitment repeatedly. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. I remembered vividly the evening 2 years into our reconciliation process when Morwen had called in crisis, her art therapy business facing yet another financial shortfall. Her voice had carried echoes of our past dynamic as she hinted at needing an emergency infusion of capital. "I understand you're struggling," I had replied, maintaining the boundaries that had become second nature. "Have you explored small business loans or investor partnerships?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Finally, she had responded, "You're right. This is my business to solve, not your emergency to fix." That moment had represented a crucial turning point, the first time Morwen had self-corrected without my intervention, recognizing her reflexive expectation and choosing a different response. Similar moments had accumulated with Thackeray, who had gradually transformed his relationship with money from entitled consumption to mindful stewardship. The evidence of their growth surrounded me now as I prepared for tomorrow's event. The Blackthorn Family Foundation had been their proposal, not mine, a suggestion that emerged during one of our monthly family dinners that had become a cornerstone of our rebuilt relationships. They had approached the idea not as beneficiaries seeking access to my resources, but as partners proposing a collaborative venture that would honor our shared values while serving broader community needs. "We've been thinking," Thackeray had begun during that pivotal conversation 18 months ago, glancing at Morwen for support, "about legacy and purpose, about what our family could contribute beyond our individual pursuits." Morwen had picked up the thread. "We know trust was broken, that we viewed your resources as our entitlement rather than your achievement. We've both been working to understand and change those patterns, but we also recognize that wealth can be a tool for positive impact when managed with integrity." They had presented a comprehensive proposal, not for their personal benefit, but for establishing a foundation that would support cancer research, arts education, and environmental conservation. Their plan included governance structures that prevented any individual from accessing funds for personal use, transparent reporting requirements, and a board of directors that would include community members alongside family representatives. "We're not asking you to fund this entirely," Thackeray had emphasized. "Morwen and I have each committed to contributing annually from our business earnings. We're seeking your partnership, not your charity." The maturity of their approach had moved me deeply. This wasn't the desperate grasping of adult children seeking to reclaim lost inheritance, but the thoughtful engagement of individuals who had done genuine work to transform their relationship with money, privilege, and family. After careful consideration and consultation with Finwick, I had agreed to establish the foundation with an initial endowment drawn from the assets I had protected during our period of estrangement. The twins would serve as directors alongside appointed community members, but the structure ensured that foundation resources could only be used for charitable purposes, never for personal enrichment. The subsequent year and a half had revealed the depth of their transformation. Thackeray had restructured his financial consulting practice to include pro bono services for cancer patients navigating the overwhelming maze of medical expenses and insurance claims. Morwen had evolved her art therapy business into a sustainable nonprofit, securing grants and community partnerships that freed her from the cycle of crisis and rescue that had previously defined her professional life. As I selected my outfit for tomorrow's launch event, a silk dress in deep sapphire blue that complemented my silver hair, I reflected on how differently this anniversary might have unfolded. Had my children succeeded in their attempts to control my assets during my illness? Had I succumbed to their pressure or failed to establish firm boundaries, we might have remained locked in toxic patterns of entitlement and resentment. Instead, the crucible of conflict had forged something unprecedented in our family history: genuine mutual respect born from the painful recognition of each other's full humanity. My children had learned to see me as a person with legitimate needs and boundaries rather than an inexhaustible resource. I had learned to trust their capacity for growth rather than enabling their dependency through preemptive rescue. The doorbell chimed, interrupting my reverie. I opened it to find Lyra standing in the hallway, her arms laden with fabric samples and event programs for tomorrow's launch. "I thought you might want to review these before the printer's final deadline," she explained, following me into the living room. "Also, I couldn't resist bringing champagne to toast your 5-year milestone a day early." As she spread the materials across my dining table, I marveled at the constancy of her friendship through every phase of this journey. Lyra had witnessed my devastation at discovering my children's betrayal, supported my decision to establish boundaries, celebrated each small victory of recovery, and cautiously endorsed the reconciliation process as it unfolded. The programs look perfect, I confirmed, admiring the elegant design that incorporated botanical motifs from my illustrations. "And yes to champagne. This milestone deserves proper recognition." As she retrieved glasses from my cabinet, Lyra glanced at me with the knowing look of someone who had observed every nuance of my transformation. "How are you feeling about tomorrow? It's a big step, publicly partnering with them again after everything that happened." I considered her question while she poured the sparkling wine. "Surprisingly peaceful," I answered. "Not because I've forgotten what happened, but because I've integrated it. The betrayal, the boundary setting, the gradual rebuilding. It's all part of our story now, not something to hide or overcome." "That's remarkably evolved of you," Lyra observed, raising her glass. "To what shall we toast?" "To second chances," I proposed, "and to the wisdom to know when they're truly earned." We clinked glasses, the crystalline sound carrying notes of celebration and survival. As we settled into comfortable chairs to review the final event details, my phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Dr. Valencia. "Confirming your appointment next week. Latest blood work looks excellent. 5 years is a beautiful milestone, Elowen. You've earned every moment of this celebration." The convergence of medical and personal healing felt profound as I considered tomorrow's event. The Blackthorn family. Foundation represented more than charitable giving or family reconciliation. It symbolized the transformation of suffering into service, of betrayal into wisdom, of near death into purposeful living. That evening, alone in my condominium after Lyra's departure, I opened my journal to record my thoughts on this significant anniversary. The leather-bound book had been my companion through the darkest days of treatment and the challenging months of establishing independence from my children's expectations. Its pages chronicled doctor's appointments, legal battles, moments of rage and grief, tentative steps toward forgiveness, and gradually, the emergence of hope. Tonight's entry felt different, less like processing trauma and more like acknowledging transformation. Tomorrow, we launch the foundation. 5 years ago, as I overheard my children dividing my possessions while I fought for life, I could never have imagined this outcome. They saw my cancer as an opportunity for premature inheritance. I experienced it as a catalyst for overdue self-assertion. The collision of these perspectives created destruction that ultimately proved creative. They lost the trust funds they felt entitled to claim. I lost the illusions that had enabled their entitlement. And from these mutual losses emerged something none of us anticipated: the possibility of authentic relationship built on respect rather than assumption, on earned trust rather than blind obligation. The foundation isn't just a charitable endeavor. It's living proof that broken things can be rebuilt stronger. that betrayal can birth wisdom, that families can evolve beyond dysfunction into conscious collaboration. Tomorrow, as we stand together, to announce this initiative, I'll be witnessing the fruit of boundaries firmly held, consequences fully experienced, and growth genuinely pursued. 5 years cancer-free, 5 years of reclaiming life on my own terms, 5 years of watching my children transform from entitled dependents into capable partners. The number feels significant, though arbitrary. Healing doesn't follow calendar dates, but milestones matter for marking distance traveled, and tomorrow's celebration honors every difficult step of this journey. I closed the journal and prepared for bed, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes from emotional completion rather than ongoing struggle. My bedroom windows offered a view of city lights twinkling against the darkness, each illuminated window representing other lives unfolding, other dramas of loss and recovery playing out in private spaces. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity that autumn brings to Meridian City. I rose early, performed my morning meditation, a practice adopted during cancer treatment that had become essential to my daily routine, and prepared for the day with deliberate attention to each detail. The sapphire dress hung perfectly, its rich color suggesting both depth and vitality. I added my grandmother's pearl earrings, retrieved from the possessions I had rescued before my children's attempted estate raid, and a silver bracelet Morwen had given me last Christmas, the first gift from her purchased with earnings from her restructured business rather than borrowed funds. The art center buzzed with activity when I arrived. Morwen stood near the entrance, directing the catering staff with newfound confidence, her artistic eye evident in the event's aesthetic details. She had traded her once perpetual bohemian chaos for elegant professionalism, though creative touches remained in her flowing dress and handcrafted jewelry. "Mom," she called, crossing the lobby to embrace me. "You look absolutely radiant. How are you feeling?" "Ready," I replied simply, returning her hug with genuine warmth, something that had taken years to rebuild after the calculating interactions of our estrangement period. Thackeray emerged from the presentation room, tablet in hand, every inch. The competent professional, but with a softness around his eyes that hadn't existed during his years of entitled expectation. "The tech team has everything set up," he reported, then paused, really looking at me. "Mom, before everyone arrives, Morwen and I wanted to thank you, not just for agreeing to the foundation, but for giving us the chance to earn back your trust. You earned it through your actions," I reminded them gently. "I simply remained open to observing the changes you chose to make." As guests began arriving, medical professionals from my treatment team, artists from the community workshops I'd joined during recovery, business leaders interested in the foundation's mission, friends who had supported me through every phase of this journey, I felt the convergence of all aspects of my reconstructed life. Cordelia arrived with her characteristic flair, now 92 but still formidable, accompanied by other members of the Crestfall Bay Garden Club. "Wouldn't miss this for anything," she declared, squeezing my hand. "I always knew those children had potential buried under all that entitlement. They just needed proper pruning." Dr. Valencia appeared with several oncology colleagues, her presence a powerful reminder of the medical journey that had catalyzed everything else. Finwick arrived with his wife, offering subtle nods of approval at the legal structures we'd carefully constructed to protect the foundation's integrity. As the room filled, I noticed Thackeray and Morwen moving confidently among the guests, articulating the foundation's mission without any trace of the self-importance that had once characterized their public personas. They spoke of service rather than status, of community impact rather than personal gain. When time came for the formal presentation, I took my place between my children at the podium, a positioning that felt symbolic of our rebuilt relationship, not hierarchy with me as the source of their sustenance, but partnership with each of us contributing unique strengths. Thackeray opened with financial projections and governance structures, his expertise evident but tempered by humility. Morwen followed with the Foundation's artistic vision, describing programs that would bring creative healing to cancer patients and arts education to underserved communities. Then it was my turn. Looking out at the assembled supporters, many of whom had witnessed different chapters of this complex story, I spoke from the heart. 5 years ago, I received 2 diagnoses. The first was ovarian cancer, a medical verdict that threatened my physical existence. The second was a revelation about relationships I had considered unshakable, a discovery that challenged everything I believed about family, trust, and love. Both diagnoses required aggressive treatment. For the cancer, I underwent experimental protocols that pushed my body to its limits, but ultimately restored my health. For the relational crisis, I prescribed equally challenging medicine: boundaries, consequences, and the terrifying practice of prioritizing my own well-being. Thank you for supporting our vision of turning personal trials into public benefit. And thank you for witnessing the rebirth of a family that chose growth over grievance, accountability over entitlement, and authentic connection over convenient fiction. The applause that followed felt like more than polite appreciation. It carried the weight of shared recognition, of stories touched and hopes renewed. As I stepped back from the podium, Thackeray and Morwen each took one of my hands, a gesture that would have felt calculated 5 years ago but now communicated genuine connection. The remainder of the event unfolded in a warm blur of conversations, commitments, and celebratory toasts. Donors pledged support, community partners proposed collaborations, and the Foundation's future took concrete shape through each interaction. Late in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the catering staff began clearing away remnants of the celebration, I found myself alone with my children in the Art Center's sculpture garden. The autumn air carried hints of approaching winter, but the setting sun painted everything in golden light that defied the season's chill. "We did it," Morwen said softly, her voice carrying wonder rather than triumph. "Not just the event, everything. The whole journey." "We did," I agreed, then added the crucial distinction that had taken years to establish. Each of us did our own work, which allowed us to come together differently. Thackeray nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I keep thinking about that day, when you overheard us talking about your things. If someone had told me then that we'd be here now, partnering on something meaningful instead of fighting over inheritance, you wouldn't have believed it?" I suggested. "I wouldn't have wanted to believe it," he corrected. "That version of me needed to hit bottom before recognizing the need to change." The honesty in his assessment moved me deeply. This was the gift that emerged from maintaining firm boundaries, the space for genuine self-reflection rather than enabled self-deception. "Mom," Morwen began hesitantly, "there's something else we wanted to discuss. The Foundation's bylaws include a provision for future family involvement, including potential grandchildren. We know neither of us has children yet, but—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. The topic of their futures, including potential families of their own, had remained largely unexplored during our reconciliation process. I understood her hesitation, wondering if I held residual doubts about their capacity for healthy family relationships given our history. "I think that provision is wonderful," I assured them. "The work you've both done on yourselves suggests you'd bring consciousness to parenting that could break generational patterns we've all struggled with." Relief flooded both their faces, followed by something deeper, the recognition that I trusted them not just with Foundation governance, but with the potential stewardship of future generations. As we prepared to leave the Art Center, Thackeray asked one final question. "Do you ever regret how much we lost during those years of estrangement?" I considered his words carefully, wanting to honor the complexity of our journey. "I regret the pain we all experienced. I regret that it took such extreme circumstances to catalyze necessary changes. But I don't regret the boundaries I established or the consequences you faced. Without them, we'd still be trapped in patterns that diminished all of us. The price of authenticity, Morwen observed quietly. Yes, I agreed, and worth every penny. The drive back to my condominium felt different from countless other evening commutes. The city lights seemed to shine with particular brilliance, reflecting the inner illumination that came from seeing a difficult journey reach meaningful resolution. My phone contained dozens of messages from event attendees, expressions of support, admiration for our family's transformation, pledges of partnership in the Foundation's work. But it was the simple text from Dr. Valencia that touched me most deeply. Healing takes many forms. Tonight, I witnessed the kind that can't be measured in scans or blood work. Congratulations on all your recoveries. 5 years of medical monitoring had taught me that cancer remission required vigilance without paranoia, awareness without fear. The same principles applied to relational healing. I would continue to maintain appropriate boundaries with my children, observe their behavior for consistency, honor my own needs without apology. But I would do so from a place of earned trust, rather than protective skepticism. Later that night, as I prepared for bed in my sanctuary of a home, I opened my laptop to find an email from Finwick. Elowen, tonight's event exceeded all expectations. The Foundation launches with strong community support and, more importantly, clear evidence of your family's genuine commitment to its mission. I've rarely seen such comprehensive transformation in my legal career. The structures we put in place to protect against future conflicts may prove unnecessary given the growth, I observed, but their existence provides everyone with beneficial clarity about expectations and boundaries. On a personal note, it's been a privilege to support your journey from that first difficult meeting about estate protection through tonight's celebration. You've demonstrated that standing firm in one's truth, while painful in the short term, creates possibilities for authentic connection that accommodation never could. Congratulations on reaching this milestone, both in health and in family healing. I saved his message in the folder containing key documents from this chapter of my life: medical reports, legal filings, correspondence marking significant moments in our family's evolution. Future generations might find value in understanding how we navigated from betrayal to reconciliation, from entitlement to earned trust. The moon hung full and luminous outside my bedroom window, casting silver light across the peaceful geometry of my space. 5 years ago, I had wondered if I would live to see another autumn. Now I looked forward to witnessing many seasons unfold, each bringing new opportunities to apply the wisdom gained through confronting mortality and reclaiming autonomy. My children had learned that love without boundaries breeds entitlement, while love with limits fosters growth. I had discovered that sacrificing oneself for others serves no one, while modeling self-respect teaches invaluable lessons. Together, we had proven that families can evolve beyond toxic patterns when each member commits to personal transformation rather than demanding others change. The Blackthorn Family Foundation would carry these learnings forward, supporting others facing similar challenges while honoring the difficult journey that made such service possible. And if future crises arose, as life inevitably presents, we would meet them with the hard-won tools of honest communication, maintained boundaries, and mutual respect for each other's full humanity. Tonight marked not an ending, but a milestone in an ongoing story of healing and growth. Cancer had initiated the dismantling of unsustainable patterns. Betrayal had revealed the necessity of self-protection. Recovery had created space for authentic reconciliation. And throughout it all, the choice to prioritize truth over comfort had illuminated a path toward genuine connection that superficial harmony could never achieve. As sleep beckoned, I felt profound gratitude, not just for survival, but for the unexpected gifts hidden within the greatest challenges of my life. My body had triumphed over cancer. My spirit had survived betrayal. My relationships had transformed through the alchemy of accountability. And tomorrow would dawn with possibilities I could never have imagined while lying in that hospital bed, listening to my children divide possessions I had not yet relinquished. The future stretched before us, bright with promise born from pain, transmuted into purpose. Whatever it held, I would meet it as the woman I had become, strong enough to love without losing herself, wise enough to trust without enabling harm, and clear enough to celebrate the redemption available when people choose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, and authentic connection over familiar dysfunction. 5 years cancer-free. A lifetime free from the patterns that had once defined and confined us all. The numbers mattered less than the transformation they represented. A family reborn through the willingness to face hard truths and do the necessary work of change. In the constellation of life's unexpected gifts, perhaps this was the brightest star, discovering that the greatest threats to our well-being sometimes carry within them the seeds of our most profound liberation. We need only possess the courage to establish boundaries, enforce consequences, and remain open to the possibility of earned redemption when genuine change takes root and flourishes. The Blackthorn Family Foundation stood as living proof that broken trust could evolve into something stronger than blind faith, that love could deepen through the practice of respect, and that families willing to do the hard work of transformation could emerge not just intact, but elevated, carrying forward lessons that might spare future generations from repeating painful patterns. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, in the quiet satisfaction of meaningful resolution, I rested in the knowledge that everything sacrificed to reach this moment had been transformed into something far more valuable than what was lost. We had traded entitled dependency for conscious partnership, toxic patterns for healthy boundaries, and the illusion of harmony for the reality of authentic connection. And that, more than any financial inheritance, was the true legacy worth leaving to the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.